Did you just hit my hand? The mafia boss slowly turned his head. The entire restaurant went silent. Yes, the waitress said calmly. And if you touch him again, I'll break your arm. For a moment, no one in Madison Grill moved. Every person in the room knew the same thing. Victor Moretti was not a man you touched. Victor slowly looked down at the hand gripping his wrist. The waitress holding him wasn't shaking. She wasn't apologizing. She was simply standing there, steady and calm, like stopping him had been the most natural decision in the world. Victor raised an eyebrow. Well, he said slowly, that's new. Behind the waitress, the restaurant manager Daniel Brooks looked like he might collapse. His cheek was still red from the slap Victor had delivered seconds earlier. Nina, Brooks whispered nervously. Please, let it go. But Nina Carter didn't release Victor's wrist yet. Her eyes stayed on him. Let him go, she said quietly. He's done nothing to you. Victor stared at her for a long second. Then he began to laugh. You hear that? Victor said, turning his head slightly toward the room. The waitress thinks she's my conscience. Victor slowly pulled his hand free, not with force but with deliberate calm. The movement alone made Brooks step back instinctively. Victor studied Nina from head to toe. Simple black uniform, hair tied back. No jewelry except a small silver watch. She looked like every other restaurant server in Chicago, except for one thing. She wasn't afraid. Victor leaned slightly closer. You know who I am? He asked. Yes. And you still grabbed my hand? Yes. Victor smiled again, but this time the smile carried something sharper. That's either very brave, he said quietly, or very stupid. Nina didn't answer. Victor turned his attention briefly to Brooks. You hire interesting staff, he said. I'm sorry, Mr. Moretti? Brooks stammered. She's new. She doesn't understand. Victor raised a finger. Brooks immediately fell silent. Victor looked back at Nina. You said you'd break my arm. I said if you touched him again. Victor glanced around the restaurant. Nearly 40 people sat in complete silence. A man near the bar slowly lowered his phone, deciding recording this might be a terrible idea. Victor spread his hands slightly. Well now, he said. I'm curious. He took a step back, clearing a little space between them. What exactly makes you think you could break my arm? A few customers exchanged uneasy looks. Victor Moretti had once been a professional MMA fighter before he built his criminal empire. That was common knowledge in Chicago. There were still old videos online of him knocking men unconscious inside cages. Nina folded her arms calmly. I didn't say I wanted to. Victor tilted his head. You just said you could. Yes. A quiet murmur moved through the room. Victor noticed it, and his grin widened. Oh, this is good, he said. He looked toward Brooks again. Tell me something, Daniel. Brooks swallowed. Yes, sir. How long has she worked here? 3 months. Victor nodded thoughtfully. Then he turned back to Nina. Well, Nina, he said, reading the name tag on her uniform. I used to be a fighter. I know. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. Do you now? He gestured to the open floor between the tables. Let's test that confidence. Nina didn't move. Victor continued loudly enough for the entire room to hear. 1 round. A few gasps slipped out from nearby tables. Victor pointed to the floor. Right here. Brooks immediately stepped forward. Mr. Moretti, please, this is a restaurant, not... Victor didn't even look at him. If you refuse, Victor said calmly to Nina, you're fired. Brooks froze. And you leave Chicago tonight. Nina glanced at Brooks. Then she untied her apron. Victor's grin returned immediately. There we go. She folded the apron neatly and placed it on the host stand beside Brooks. Then she stepped forward into the open space between the tables. The restaurant shifted as people pushed their chairs back slightly to make room. Victor removed his jacket slowly and tossed it onto a nearby chair. He rolled his shoulders. You sure about this? He asked. Yes. Victor chuckled. You don't even look nervous. I'm not. Victor bounced lightly once on the balls of his feet. Old habits. Muscle memory from years inside cages. Well, he said, let's see what you've got. Without warning, he threw a quick jab. The kind of jab that used to start fights in professional arenas. But Nina didn't flinch. Her head moved an inch to the side. The punch cut through empty air. Victor blinked. Just once. Then Nina stepped inside his reach. Her fist drove into his ribs with a tight, brutal hook. The sound was dull and heavy. Victor's breath vanished in a single shocked gasp. Before he could recover, a jab snapped his head back. Another one. The entire restaurant went silent again. Victor staggered half a step. For the first time since he walked through the door, he looked surprised. Nina lowered her hands slightly. "Do you want to stop now?" she asked. "Oh," he said, grinning through blood. "Oh, I like you." Then he lunged forward. Victor Moretti lunged forward like a man who had suddenly remembered who he was. The distance between them vanished in an instant. His right hand cut through the air in a brutal cross aimed straight at Nina's jaw. It was not the playful jab he had thrown earlier. This was the kind of punch that had ended professional fights. Several people in the restaurant gasped. Nina moved before the punch arrived. Her head slipped to the outside of his shoulder, her feet pivoting lightly on the hardwood floor. Victor's fist passed inches from her cheek. A few of the older men at the bar leaned forward. One of them muttered under his breath, "Jesus, she slipped that clean." Victor didn't slow down. Fighters like him never did. When the first strike missed, the second followed automatically. He threw a left hook. Nina ducked under it. The movement was so smooth it barely looked like effort. Her shoulder brushed his chest as she moved inside his reach. Victor realized the mistake too late. Her fist drove into his ribs again. Thud. The sound was deep, ugly. Victor's breath caught in his throat. His body instinctively folded forward for a fraction of a second. It was all Nina needed. Her right hand snapped up into a short uppercut that cracked against his chin. Victor staggered backward. Chairs scraped across the floor as several customers instinctively pushed away from the expanding fight. For a moment, Victor simply blinked. The room watched the impossible. Victor Moretti had just taken 2 clean hits. Blood still trickled from his nose, now spreading across his upper lip. But the shock in his eyes quickly turned into something else. Respect. "Well now," Victor said hoarsely. He rolled his shoulders once, as if resetting his body. "That wasn't luck." Nina remained calm. Her weight balanced evenly between her feet. "You asked for a round." Victor nodded slowly. "You're right." Then his expression hardened. "Let's make it interesting." He came forward again, faster this time. The years since his professional career had taken away some speed, but not his power. His fists came in combinations now: jab, cross, hook, each one heavy enough to drop most men. Nina didn't try to block them. She moved. Slip, step, pivot. Every punch Victor threw met empty air or brushed harmlessly past her shoulders. The movement was controlled, precise, like someone dancing inside a storm. One of the retired detectives near the bar whispered to his friend, "That girl's trained." Victor began to realize the same thing. His breathing grew heavier as frustration crept in. "You're not just a waitress," he said. "No." Victor threw another cross. Nina slipped inside again. Her fist slammed into his liver. Victor grunted. The pain shot through his body like electricity. A younger man near the back of the restaurant whispered nervously to his wife, "Is he losing?" Victor heard that, and it made him angry. Real anger. He swung wider now, abandoning technique for raw force. The right hook came like a hammer. Nina ducked beneath it and stepped behind him. Before Victor could turn, her arms wrapped around his waist. The movement happened so fast several people didn't understand what they were seeing. Then Nina lifted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't flashy, but the leverage was perfect. Victor Moretti, 6'3", 200 pounds, was suddenly no longer standing. His feet left the floor. A split second later, he crashed onto his back against the hardwood. The impact echoed through the restaurant. Gasps erupted across the room. Victor groaned as the air exploded from his lungs. Before he could roll away, Nina moved again. Her knee slid across his torso, pinning his hips. Her arm slipped under his chin. Victor's eyes widened. Wait. Too late. Her forearm tightened across his throat while her other hand locked the hold in place. A rear choke. One of the detectives at the bar stared in disbelief. "She's got him." Victor grabbed at her arm, trying to break the hold. But Nina had already positioned herself perfectly. His strength meant nothing without leverage. His breathing grew shorter. The room held its breath. Victor Moretti, the man who controlled half the criminal rackets in Chicago, was now trapped beneath a restaurant waitress. His face turned red, then darker. He struggled again. Nothing changed. Nina spoke quietly near his ear. "You should tap." Victor's hands stopped moving for a moment. Across the restaurant, dozens of eyes watched him. Powerful men, business owners, people who had spent years pretending Victor Moretti was untouchable. Now they saw him pinned to the floor. Victor understood exactly what that meant. His pride screamed at him not to give in, but his lungs were beginning to burn, and Nina's grip was only tightening. Finally, his hand slapped the floor. Once, twice. The sound echoed through the silent restaurant. What did you feel in that moment when Victor finally had to tap? Power, pride, and the unexpected turning of the tables all in a few seconds. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what you think about Nina's move. And if this scene kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for more stories where justice shows up in the most unexpected ways. Nina released him immediately and stood up. Victor rolled onto his side, coughing violently as air rushed back into his lungs. No one spoke. Not the customers, not the staff, not even the piano player. Victor slowly pushed himself up onto one knee. Blood still ran from his nose. His chest rose and fell heavily as he looked up at Nina. For a long moment they simply stared at each other. Then Victor began to laugh. The sound filled the restaurant. Not cruel, not angry, genuine. Well, he said between breaths, I'll be damned. He wiped the blood from his mouth with the back of his hand and stood. The room instinctively stepped back as he regained his full height. Nina calmly picked up her apron from the host stand and tied it around her waist again. Victor watched the motion carefully. You know, he said, most people who embarrass me don't live very long. Daniel Brooks looked like he might faint, but Nina only shrugged. Maybe you shouldn't hit people in restaurants. Victor stared at her. Then slowly, he smiled again. This time the smile carried something thoughtful. Maybe I shouldn't, he admitted. He picked up his jacket and brushed invisible dust from the sleeve. Then he leaned slightly closer to Nina. What's your name? Nina. Nina what? Carter. Victor nodded. Nina Carter. He looked around the room at the stunned customers. Remember that name, he said. Then he turned back toward Nina. You fight like someone who's done it before. Nina didn't answer. Victor studied her for another moment. Then he chuckled. I think tonight just got interesting. And for the first time since he walked into Madison Grill, Victor Moretti left without another word. The door closed behind him. Only then did the restaurant begin breathing again. Daniel Brooks leaned against the host stand, rubbing his face in disbelief. My God, he whispered. One of the older detectives at the bar raised his glass slightly toward Nina. Kid, he said quietly, I haven't seen a takedown that clean since 1987. Nina only gave a small, polite nod, but her eyes had already drifted toward the door Victor had just walked through. Because something in his laugh worried her. Victor Moretti had not looked like a man who planned revenge. He had looked like a man who had just discovered something valuable. And men like Victor Moretti never walked away from valuable things. The door of Madison Grill had barely stopped swinging when the room finally exhaled. Conversations returned in hesitant whispers. Glasses clinked again. Someone near the bar nervously laughed, the sound thin and uncertain, like a man testing whether danger had truly passed. Daniel Brooks wiped sweat from his forehead and leaned both hands on the host stand. Lord help me, he muttered. I thought that man was going to kill someone tonight. Nina finished tying the knot on her apron and stepped behind the counter as if nothing unusual had happened. A couple at table 6 stared at her. A man near the bar raised his glass toward her again. Miss, he said, half amazed. I'm 72 years old and that's the first time I've ever seen Victor Moretti lose a fight. A quiet ripple of laughter moved through the restaurant. But it wasn't the laughter of people who found something funny. It was the laughter of people who had just witnessed something impossible. Nina picked up a tray and began collecting empty glasses. Your bourbon's getting warm, sir, she told the man politely. The pianist slowly returned to his bench and resumed playing, though the melody was softer now, more cautious. Brooks watched Nina move across the room. He had managed restaurants for 30 years. He knew people well enough to recognize when someone was hiding something, and Nina Carter had just fought like a professional. He walked over to her quietly. Nina, he said. She looked up. Yes, Mr. Brooks. What the hell was that? She placed 2 glasses onto the tray. He challenged me. That's not what I mean. Brooks lowered his voice. You moved like a fighter. Nina didn't answer immediately. She wiped a ring of condensation from the table with a cloth. I've taken a few classes. Brooks stared at her. Classes don't make you choke out Victor Moretti in my dining room. A couple at a nearby table leaned closer, pretending not to listen. Nina finally sighed. Look, she said softly. He was hitting you. Brooks shook his head. That man hits whoever he wants. Well, Nina replied calmly. He didn't tonight. Brooks rubbed his temples. You don't understand the problem. What problem? The problem, Brooks whispered, is that Victor Moretti doesn't forget things like this. Across the room, one of the retired detectives spoke up from the bar. That's the truth. His name was Hank Doyle, a former homicide investigator who had spent 25 years on the Chicago police force before retiring. He took a slow sip of whiskey. Men like Moretti, Hank continued, don't lose in public and shrug it off. Another older man sitting beside him nodded. Humiliation sticks with people who build their lives on fear. Nina set the tray down. I didn't humiliate him. Hank raised an eyebrow. Kid, he said, you choked out the most dangerous man in Chicago in front of 40 witnesses. He lifted his glass. That's humiliation. Nina leaned against the counter. Then maybe he deserved it. The bar went quiet again. Hank studied her carefully. You're not wrong, he said slowly. But the world doesn't reward people for being right. Brooks exhaled heavily. That's what I've been trying to tell her. One of the businessmen from table 4 spoke up. You should leave town. Nina looked at him. Why? Because men like Moretti solve problems in permanent ways. Another voice joined in. He's buried people for less. Hank swirled the last of his drink thoughtfully. Depends, he said. On what? On what kind of man he is. Brooks scoffed. I'll tell you what kind of man he is. A violent one. True, Hank admitted. But violence doesn't mean stupidity. The older detective leaned forward slightly, elbows on the bar. Let me tell you something about men who used to fight professionally. Nina looked at him. They respect skill, Hank said. They understand what it takes to step into a fight and win. He gestured toward the floor where Victor had been pinned moments earlier. You didn't cheat him. You didn't cheap shot him. You beat him clean. Nina folded her arms. So what does that mean? Hank shrugged. It means he might want revenge. Brooks groaned. That's not comforting. Hank smiled faintly. Or, he continued, he might want to know who the hell you are. Nina didn't respond, but something about that possibility made her uneasy. Across the restaurant, a couple paid their bill quickly and left. Another group whispered excitedly about what they had just seen. Within minutes, the story had already begun spreading. Chicago was a city built on stories, and nothing traveled faster than the fall of a powerful man. Brooks leaned closer to Nina. You need to tell me the truth. What truth? Who are you really? Nina met his eyes calmly. I'm your waitress. Brooks seethed. You know what I mean. For a moment, Nina considered answering. Then she picked up the tray again. Table 3 needs refills. Brooks watched her walk away. Unbelievable, he muttered. At the bar, Hank Doyle finished his drink and stood. As Nina passed him, he spoke quietly. Kid. She stopped. You didn't panic once. Nina shrugged. People panic when they're afraid. Hank nodded slowly. Exactly. He placed money on the counter for his drink. Then he leaned closer and lowered his voice. You ever hear the phrase, quiet professionals? Nina didn't answer. It's what we used to call people who knew how to handle violence without talking about it. He studied her face. You look like one of those. Nina finally smiled slightly. Good night, Mr. Doyle. Night, kid. Hank put on his coat and headed toward the door. Before leaving, he glanced outside through the glass. Then he frowned, because across the street, parked beneath a streetlight, sat a black SUV. Inside it, a familiar silhouette watched the restaurant. Victor Moretti had not gone far. Hank exhaled slowly. Well, he murmured to himself, that answers that. Inside the SUV, Victor sat with one elbow resting on the steering wheel. A small napkin pressed against his nose had already turned red, but he wasn't angry. In fact, his expression looked almost amused. His phone rested in his other hand. A message had already been sent. 2 words. Find her. Victor looked through the window at the restaurant again, at the silhouette of Nina moving between tables. Then he smiled to himself. Interesting, he said quietly. Because Victor Moretti had spent most of his adult life surrounded by people who were afraid of him, fear was predictable. Fear was boring. But Nina Carter had looked him in the eye while choking him unconscious. And that, Victor tapped the steering wheel thoughtfully. That was rare. Very rare. He started the engine of the SUV, and as he pulled away from the curb, Victor Moretti realized something he had not felt in a very long time. Curiosity. Victor Moretti did not drive far. Chicago at night shimmered with reflections from wet pavement and yellow streetlights. but Victor barely noticed the city around him. His mind stayed fixed on a single image, a waitress, standing calmly in the middle of a restaurant, choking him out in front of 40 witnesses. Victor wiped the last trace of blood from his nose with a handkerchief and tossed it onto the passenger seat. Then he laughed quietly. Damn. The SUV rolled into a private parking garage beneath a tall building on North Michigan Avenue. The building looked like any other luxury office tower from the outside, but several of its upper floors belonged to Victor. He stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward the elevator without hurry. 2 security guards at the entrance straightened immediately. Evening, Mr. Moretti. Victor nodded once. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. A minute later, he stepped into a large penthouse office that overlooked the glowing skyline of Chicago. The room was quiet except for the low hum of computers. A thin man in his early 30s sat behind a desk surrounded by monitors. Julian Mercer looked up as Victor entered. Julian was not a fighter. He had the pale complexion and restless eyes of someone who spent most of his life behind screens, but what he lacked in muscle he made up for with information. Julian could find almost anyone. Victor loosened his collar and sat in the leather chair across from the desk. Julian tilted his head. You look like you lost a bar fight. Victor chuckled. That obvious? Julian leaned back. With respect, boss, your nose is still bleeding. Victor wiped it again and shrugged. Tonight was unusual. Julian tapped a few keys on his keyboard. Should I ask? Victor rested his elbows on the desk. Tell me something, Julian. Yes. If a waitress in a steakhouse slipped 3 of your punches and choked you out in 30 seconds, what would you think? Julian blinked. I would think I was hallucinating. Victor smiled. That's exactly what I thought. Julian studied him carefully. You're serious? Oh, I'm very serious. Victor leaned back in the chair. She moved like a trained fighter. How trained? Victor thought for a moment. Professional. Julian raised an eyebrow. Professional fighters don't usually serve steak and bourbon. That's why I'm here. Victor tapped the desk. Find her. Julian's fingers moved across the keyboard. Name. Nina Carter. Julian frowned slightly. That sounds generic. Victor nodded. That's what worries me. Within seconds, multiple windows opened on Julian's screens. Driver's license records. Social security databases. Employment history. Julian scanned through them rapidly. All right, he said slowly. Nina Carter. 29 years old. Current address listed in Chicago. Works at Madison Grill. He stopped. That's odd. Victor leaned forward. What? No record before 3 years ago. Victor's eyes sharpened. None? Julian shook his head. No college records, no medical history, no previous employment. That's impossible. Exactly. Julian turned one of the monitors toward Victor. The Nina Carter identity appears suddenly 3 years ago. Victor leaned back again. Someone built that identity. Looks that way. Julian began typing again. If she's a professional fighter, there might be footage somewhere. He opened a sports archive database. Thousands of fight records appeared. Male or female? Julian asked. Female. Julian filtered the search. A moment later, he froze. Well, that didn't take long. Victor stood and walked around the desk. What did you find? Julian enlarged an image on the screen. It showed a crowded arena cage. Inside stood a female fighter raising her fists in victory. Her hair was tied back. Her stance was familiar. Victor recognized it instantly. That's her. Julian nodded slowly. Name's not Nina Carter. Victor crossed his arms. What is it? Julian zoomed in on the fighter's name, printed across the poster behind her. Nina, Iron Caldwell. Victor stared at the screen. Caldwell. Julian opened another file. Professional MMA record. 22 wins, 2 losses. Victor whistled softly. That explains the choke. Julian continued reading. She fought in several national promotions, built a reputation for technical grappling. Victor smiled faintly. Yeah, I noticed. Julian scrolled further. Then his expression changed. Huh. What now? Julian turned toward Victor. She disappeared 3 years ago. Victor's eyes narrowed. Why? Julian read the article on screen. A news report says her father was killed during a robbery connected to Russian organized crime. Victor's smile vanished. The Bratva? Looks like it. Julian opened another file. After the incident, she vanished from the sport completely. No interviews. No fights. No public appearances. Victor stared at the photo of Nina Caldwell again. The same calm eyes. The same controlled posture. So she ran. Julian nodded. Looks like it. Victor returned to his chair and folded his hands. People don't vanish unless they're afraid. Julian looked at him carefully. So, what do you want to do? Victor thought about the fight again. The slip. The liver shot. The choke. Then he smiled slowly. Nothing. Julian blinked. Nothing? For now. Victor stood and walked toward the window overlooking the city. Men like me, he said quietly. Don't run into people like her very often. Julian crossed his arms. She embarrassed you. Victor nodded. True. Julian waited. And you're not angry? Victor chuckled. Oh, I'm angry. He turned back toward the desk. But I'm also curious. Julian raised an eyebrow. Curiosity can be dangerous. Victor smiled. Only if you're boring. He picked up his coat from the chair. Keep watching her. Julian nodded. Already done. Victor walked toward the elevator. Just before the doors closed, he added one more sentence. And Julian? Yes. If the Russians are hunting her. Julian waited. Victor's smile returned. They might come looking in Chicago. The elevator doors slid shut. Julian stared at the screen showing Nina Caldwell's fight record. Then he muttered quietly to himself. Well, that waitress just became the most interesting woman in the city. Morning arrived quietly over Chicago. But Nina Carter had slept very little. The alarm clock on the small nightstand beside her bed blinked 6:30 a.m., though she had already been awake for nearly an hour. The apartment was modest, a one-bedroom unit above an old laundromat on the south side. The walls were thin, pipes groaned occasionally inside them, and the faint smell of detergent drifted upward from the machines downstairs. Nina sat at the edge of her bed, tying the laces on a pair of worn running shoes. The previous night kept replaying in her mind. Victor Moretti hitting the manager, the restaurant going silent, the moment she grabbed his wrist, then the fight. She had reacted without thinking. Years of muscle memory had taken over before logic could stop her. That was the problem with being trained to fight. Sometimes your body made decisions your future had to pay for. She finished tying the second shoe and stood. Outside, early morning light stretched across the street. Chicago was quieter at that hour. Delivery trucks rolled past. A man walked a large German shepherd down the sidewalk. Nina stepped outside and began running. The cold air felt good in her lungs. Running helped her think. 3 years ago, she had disappeared intentionally. After her father's death, she had walked away from everything connected to fighting cameras, arenas, interviews, sponsorships. She built a quiet life under a new name. A life where no one looked twice at her. Last night had cracked that quiet life open. Victor Moretti was not the kind of man who forgot humiliation. And he certainly wasn't the kind who let people choke him unconscious in public. Nina turned a corner and increased her pace. She ran for nearly 40 minutes before slowing near the lakefront. The wind off Lake Michigan cut through the early sunlight. Cold and sharp, she stopped at a railing overlooking the water. Her breath steadied. For the first time that morning, she felt the familiar instinct whispering in the back of her mind. Leave. Start over somewhere else. She had done it before. Disappear. New name. New city. But something about that idea didn't sit right this time. Running had kept her alive these past 3 years. Yet running also meant surrendering pieces of herself. And Nina Carter was tired of surrendering. She walked back toward her apartment with that thought lingering quietly inside her. Across the city, Victor Moretti was finishing breakfast. His penthouse dining room overlooked the Chicago skyline. A simple meal sat on the table, black coffee, toast, eggs, and fresh fruit. Victor believed in discipline, even after leaving professional fighting. Old habits were difficult to break. He folded the morning newspaper and set it aside. Julian Mercer sat across from him with a laptop open. I've been tracking her schedule, Julian said. Victor raised an eyebrow. That didn't take long. She keeps a routine, Julian replied. Victor took a sip of coffee. Tell me. Julian glanced at the screen. She runs every morning around 6. Returns home by 7. Works evening shifts at Madison Grill. Victor nodded slowly. Disciplined. That's typical for fighters, Julian said. Victor stood and walked toward the large window. The city stretched out beneath him, steel towers, traffic, endless movement. You ever notice something about fighters, Julian? Julian looked up. What's that? They don't stop being fighters. Julian nodded. I believe that. Victor turned back toward the table. So what do you plan to do about her? Victor smiled slightly. Nothing yet. Julian frowned. You usually move faster than that. Victor leaned against the table. That's because most problems are simple. And this one isn't? No. Victor picked up a small orange and rolled it slowly across the table. She didn't attack me first. Julian waited. She stepped in because I hit the manager. That's true. Victor peeled the orange calmly, which means she believes in something. Julian raised an eyebrow. You sound impressed. Victor shrugged. I respect conviction. Julian tapped the keyboard. There's another development you might find interesting. Victor looked up. The Russian Bratva. Victor's expression sharpened. What about them? They still have an active bounty attached to Nina Caldwell. Victor's eyes darkened slightly. How much? 500,000. Victor laughed quietly. That explains the disappearance. Julian nodded. If they discover she's in Chicago, they'll come. Exactly. Victor thought about that for a moment. Then he finished the last piece of orange and wiped his hands with a napkin. Julian. Yes. Do me a favor. Julian waited. If anyone from the Bratva starts asking about a waitress named Nina Carter. Victor's smile returned. Let me know. Julian studied him. You're not planning to hand her over. Victor chuckled. Where's the fun in that? Julian leaned back in his chair. Sometimes I forget you were a fighter. Victor picked up his jacket from the chair. You never really stop being one. Julian glanced at the screen again. So what happens next? Victor paused near the door. Next? Yes. Victor slipped on his jacket. Next, he said. I pay Madison Grill another visit. Julian smirked. You think she'll fight you again? Victor opened the door. No. Why not? Victor's voice drifted back through the doorway. Because this time I'm not challenging her. The door closed. Julian looked back at the photo of Nina Caldwell on the monitor. Then he muttered quietly, this city is about to get interesting. That evening, Madison Grill filled again with its usual crowd. Businessmen discussed contracts. Old friends shared whiskey. The piano played softly near the bar. Daniel Brooks nervously checked the door every few minutes. Because rumors had already begun circulating through Chicago, Victor Moretti had lost a fight. And sooner or later, men like Victor always returned. Nina stepped into the dining room carrying a tray of drinks. Her face remained calm, but inside she felt the same instinct she had felt that morning. Something was coming. She didn't know what yet. But fighters learned to recognize danger long before it arrived. And somewhere in Chicago, the pieces of a much larger fight were beginning to move. The dinner rush at Madison Grill arrived like it always did, slow at first, then suddenly overwhelming. By 6 o'clock, nearly every table was full. The air smelled of grilled ribeye, garlic butter, and expensive bourbon. Conversations overlapped across the room while the piano player worked through a slow version of Autumn Leaves. Nina moved between tables with quiet efficiency, balancing a tray of glasses in one hand. To most people watching, she looked exactly like what she appeared to be, a hard-working waitress on a busy shift. But Nina had spent years inside fight gyms where awareness meant survival. Even while pouring wine or clearing plates, a part of her mind constantly scanned the room. Entrances, exits, people, movements. So when the front door opened again, she noticed immediately. Daniel Brooks noticed too. The color drained from his face. Victor Moretti stepped inside the restaurant once more. But this time something was different. There was no shouting, no arrogant announcement. Victor simply walked in like any other customer. That alone made the room uneasy. Several regulars exchanged nervous glances. Hank Doyle sat at the bar again, nursing a glass of whiskey. When he saw Victor enter, his eyebrows rose slightly. Well now, he murmured quietly. Victor removed his coat and handed it to the hostess with polite calm. Evening. His voice carried none of the sharp arrogance from the night before. Brooks hurried forward cautiously. Mr. Moretti. Victor nodded. Daniel. The manager blinked. Victor had never called him by his first name before. Brooks cleared his throat. Your table is ready. Victor glanced around the room. His eyes found Nina immediately. She was standing near table 5 with a tray in her hands. For a moment they simply looked at each other across the restaurant. Then Victor spoke calmly. I'll sit wherever she's serving. Brooks hesitated. Sir, Victor smiled faintly. I think we should talk. The room had gone quiet again. Nina walked toward them, setting her tray down on the counter along the way. Brooks looked between them nervously. Nina, you don't have to. It's fine, she said. Victor gestured toward a nearby table. After you. Nina sat across from him. Victor leaned back in his chair like a man settling into a casual conversation. Brooks hovered nearby like someone standing too close to a lightning strike. Victor glanced up at him. "You can relax, Daniel." Brooks forced a weak smile and retreated a few steps. The nearby tables pretended not to watch, but every ear in the room was listening. Victor folded his hands on the table. "You surprised me last night." Nina said nothing. Victor tilted his head slightly. "Most people who stand up to me are either very stupid or very brave. Which one am I?" Victor considered the question. "Neither." He smiled faintly. "You're trained." Nina's expression didn't change. Victor leaned forward slightly. "I had someone look into you. I figured. Your name isn't Nina Carter." A few customers closer to the table stiffened. Victor continued calmly. "Nina Caldwell." Still no reaction. Victor nodded to himself. 22 wins, 2 losses, professional MMA. He studied her carefully. "You disappeared 3 years ago." Nina finally spoke. "Are you here to threaten me?" Victor chuckled. "If I wanted to threaten you, Nina, we wouldn't be sitting in a restaurant." That answer didn't comfort Brooks at all. Victor leaned back again. "You embarrassed me." "I noticed." Victor laughed quietly. "That alone makes you interesting." Nina crossed her arms. "You didn't come here to compliment me." "No." Victor's eyes sharpened slightly. "I came because something else is happening." Nina watched him carefully. "What?" Victor lowered his voice. "The Russian Bratva." Nina's body went still. Victor noticed. "So you know the name." "I've heard it." Victor rested his elbows on the table. "They're looking for you." "That's not new." $500,000. Several people at nearby tables froze. Victor continued calmly. "That kind of money attracts attention." Nina looked down briefly, then back up. "So what does this have to do with you?" Victor smiled. "Chicago is my city. And when foreign criminals start hunting people in my city," he shrugged. "I like to know why." Nina studied him. "You're not protecting me." "No." "Then why tell me?" Victor leaned forward slightly. "Because if the Bratva finds you here, they won't care who gets hurt." He gestured subtly around the restaurant. "Places like this become collateral damage." Brooks swallowed nervously from across the room. Victor watched Nina carefully. "You fought to protect your manager last night." "Yes." "That tells me something." "What?" "You don't like innocent people getting caught in violence." Nina didn't answer. Victor stood slowly. "Which means you might consider leaving before the Russians arrive." Nina remained seated. "Is that a threat or advice?" Victor shrugged. "Call it professional courtesy." He placed a $100 bill on the table. "For dinner." "You didn't order anything." Victor smiled. "Next time." He turned toward the door. Halfway there he paused and looked back at Nina. "One more thing." "What?" Victor's voice softened slightly. "You fight well." Nina said nothing. Victor nodded once. Then he walked out of Madison Grill again. The door closed behind him. For several seconds, the restaurant remained completely silent. Then Brooks rushed over. "What the hell was that?" Nina exhaled slowly. "Trouble." Hank Doyle lifted his whiskey glass at the bar. "Kid," he said quietly, "if the Russian mob really is looking for you." He shook his head. "This city's about to become very dangerous." Nina looked toward the door Victor had just walked through, and for the first time since she had arrived in Chicago 3 years earlier, she felt the past catching up with her. The dinner rush slowly faded after Victor Moretti left the restaurant. Customers finished their meals more quickly than usual, conversations dropping to quiet murmurs as people paid their checks and stepped out into the Chicago night. The atmosphere in Madison Grill felt different now, tenser, heavier, like a storm gathering just beyond the windows. Daniel Brooks stood behind the host stand, rubbing his temples. "I should have retired 5 years ago," he muttered. Nina was wiping down table 7. Hank Doyle remained at the bar, his glass of whiskey untouched for several minutes as he watched her. Finally, he stood and walked over. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. Nina shrugged. "It's a free country." Hank lowered himself into the chair across from her. "You don't look surprised." "About what?" "About the Russians." Nina folded the cloth in her hands carefully. "People don't offer $500,000 for nothing." Hank studied her for a moment. "I was a detective for 25 years, he said quietly. "I know. I've seen people lie to protect themselves. I've seen people run when trouble shows up." He leaned forward slightly. "You don't strike me as either type." Nina gave a faint smile. "You don't know me." Hank nodded slowly. "Fair enough." He reached for his glass and took a sip. But I do know Victor Moretti. Nina glanced toward the door. Do you? Hank set the glass down. Men like him build their reputations on fear. The moment people stop fearing them, their power cracks. And you cracked it last night. Nina sighed softly. That wasn't the plan. No, Hank agreed. But now he's interested. Nina's expression tightened slightly. Interested how? Hank shrugged. That's the problem. Victor doesn't get curious about people often. Across the restaurant, Daniel Brooks was locking the front door. The staff had already gone home. Only a few lights remained on. Brooks approached the table nervously. I'm closing up. Nina nodded. I'll finish cleaning. Brooks hesitated. Nina, maybe you should take a few days off. And do what? I don't know. Visit family. I don't have any. Brooks sea-hilled. You understand what kind of men we're talking about now. Yes. And you're still staying? Nina met his eyes calmly. I've spent 3 years running. Brooks didn't know how to answer that. Hank stood and put on his coat. Well, the old detective said quietly. Chicago's a strange city. How so? Nina asked. Sometimes the worst storms clear the air. He nodded toward the door. Good luck, kid. Thanks. Hank stepped outside into the cool night air. The street looked quiet. Too quiet. His instincts, sharpened by decades of police work, made him pause. Across the street, a black sedan sat parked beneath a streetlight. The engine was running. 2 men sat inside. Hank frowned. He had learned long ago to recognize the posture of men who carried weapons. And those 2 men definitely carried weapons. Inside Madison Grill, Nina finished stacking chairs on the last table. Brooks was counting the register. Nina, he called softly. Yeah? You ever notice how trouble never arrives alone? Nina looked up. What do you mean? Brooks pointed toward the front window. 2 men were walking toward the entrance. They weren't customers. Their coats were too heavy for the mild weather. Their eyes moved across the restaurant with cold precision. Nina felt something tighten in her chest. Brooks whispered, Friends of yours? No. The men reached the door. One of them knocked twice. Hard. Brooks froze. We're closed, he called. The men didn't leave. Instead, the door handle slowly turned. Brooks had forgotten to lock it completely. The door opened. The 2 men stepped inside. They spoke with thick Russian accents. Evening. The taller one scanned the room. Then his eyes landed on Nina. He smiled. Well, that was easier than expected. Brooks swallowed. I think you're in the wrong place. The shorter man ignored him. He stepped forward slowly. You are Nina Caldwell. It wasn't a question. Nina didn't answer. The tall man reached inside his coat. Brooks took a step backward. You shouldn't do that here, he stammered. The Russian laughed softly. You Americans always say that. The gun appeared in his hand. The piano bench in the corner scraped loudly as Brooks stumbled backward. Nina's eyes never left the weapon. 3 years ago, she had promised herself she would never live this life again. Never run. Never fight. Never bring violence into the lives of ordinary people. But the Bratva had found her, and they had brought the war to Madison Grill. The shorter Russian took another step closer. Come with us, or we take you. Nina exhaled slowly. No. The man tilted his head. No? No. The gun lifted slightly. At that exact moment, the front door swung open again. A calm voice spoke from behind them. That's not how we behave in restaurants. Both Russians turned. Victor Moretti stood in the doorway. His hands rested casually in the pockets of his coat. 2 large men stood behind him. The taller Russian frowned. Who are you? Victor smiled. I own this city. The shorter man scoffed. We are not afraid of you. Victor's eyes moved calmly from the gun to Nina. You should be. The Russian raised the weapon. Victor sea-hid. Gentlemen. His voice was almost bored. This is exactly why I hate uninvited guests. Before the Russian could react, Victor moved. The fight exploded in a blur of motion. Victor moved before the Russian gunman could finish raising the weapon. Years earlier, inside steel cages under bright arena lights, Victor Moretti had learned that speed often mattered more than strength. Old instincts returned the moment violence entered the room. His hand shot forward, knocking the gun sideways just as the trigger squeezed. The shot exploded into the ceiling. Plaster dust rained down across the dining room. Before the gunman could react again, Victor's elbow slammed into his jaw. The crack echoed through Madison Grill. The man staggered backward into a table. Chairs crashed across the floor. The second Russian reached into his coat. but Victor's men were already moving. Sal and Vinny, both built like brick walls in tailored jackets, closed the distance in 2 steps. Sal drove his shoulder into the Russian's chest, slamming him against the wall hard enough to rattle the framed photographs. The man tried to pull a knife. Vinny grabbed his wrist and twisted. The knife clattered onto the floor. For a moment, the restaurant looked less like a quiet steakhouse and more like a barroom brawl from an old movie. Daniel Brooks crouched behind the bar with his hands over his head. "Oh, Lord," he whispered. "Oh, Lord." Nina remained standing near the center of the room. Her eyes followed every movement with calm precision. The first Russian tried to recover from Victor's elbow strike. Victor didn't give him the chance. He stepped forward and drove a straight punch into the man's stomach. The air exploded out of the Russian's lungs. Victor caught the gun hand, twisted sharply, and forced the weapon free. The gun slid across the hardwood floor. Victor shoved the man backward into a booth. "Stay down," he said coldly. The man groaned but didn't move. Across the room, Sal and Vinny finished subduing the second attacker. Vinny pushed the Russian face first onto the floor and planted a knee into his back. The entire fight had lasted less than 15 seconds. Silence returned to Madison Grill. Victor brushed imaginary dust from his sleeve. "I told you," he said calmly. "This is my city." Nina looked at the 2 restrained Russians, then back at Victor. "You followed them." Victor shrugged. "Let's say I anticipated them." Brooks slowly lifted his head from behind the bar. Is it over?" Victor glanced toward him. "Yes, Daniel. You may stop praying." Brooks stood carefully, his hands shaking. "I am calling the police." Victor raised a hand. "That won't be necessary." Brooks stared at him. "They brought a gun into my restaurant. And they will leave your restaurant." Victor looked down at the man pinned under Vinny's knee. Quietly, the Russian glared up at him. "You cannot stop the Bratva." Victor crouched slightly so their eyes were level. "I don't need to stop them," he said softly. "I only need to make Chicago uncomfortable for them." He stood again. "Vinny." "Yes, boss." "Take our guests outside." The 2 Russians were dragged toward the door, still groaning and muttering threats. The door slammed shut behind them. The restaurant fell silent again. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator behind the bar remained. Brooks wiped his face with a trembling hand. "I need a drink." He poured himself a small glass of whiskey and swallowed it immediately. Victor turned toward Nina. For the first time since entering, his expression looked more serious. "You see the problem now." Nina crossed her arms. "You didn't come here to help me." Victor tilted his head slightly. "No." "Then why did you?" Victor walked slowly around one of the overturned tables. "Because chaos attracts attention. And attention attracts enemies." He stopped a few feet away from her. "The Russians coming here tonight was predictable." Nina studied him. "You wanted them to find me." Victor smiled faintly. "Not exactly." "Then what?" Victor leaned casually against the back of a chair. "I wanted to see how you handled it." Nina frowned. "You're testing me." Victor didn't deny it. "People show their true character when they're under pressure." "And what did you learn?" Victor looked around the room. "You didn't panic. You didn't run. You stood your ground." He nodded once. "That tells me everything I need to know." Nina's voice hardened slightly. "I'm not joining your organization." Victor laughed. "That wasn't the offer." Brooks looked back and forth between them nervously. "What offer?" Victor ignored him. He stepped closer to Nina. "You have a problem. So do you." Victor shrugged. "True. But mine is easier to solve." "How?" "Money." Nina remained silent. Victor continued. "The Bratva put $500,000 on your head." "Yes. That kind of bounty means they won't stop sending men." Nina glanced toward the door. "I know." Victor spread his hands. "You can keep running. Or you can fight." Nina's eyes narrowed. "Fight who?" Victor smiled slowly. "Everyone." Brooks nearly choked on his drink. "What?" Victor turned toward him briefly. "Daniel, have you ever heard of something called the Apex Tournament?" Brooks shook his head quickly. "I don't want to." Victor looked back at Nina. "Underground fights," he explained. "Organized crime families settle territory disputes with them." Nina said nothing. Victor continued. "This year the tournament happens in Chicago, and you want me to fight." Victor nodded. "If you win, the Bratva problem disappears." Nina stared at him. "That's not how the Russian mob works." Victor smiled. "No, but if you beat their champion in front of every criminal organization in the Midwest." He leaned slightly closer. "They'll think twice before chasing you." The room went quiet again. Brooks whispered from the bar, "This is insane." Victor straightened. "Maybe." Then he looked directly into Nina's eyes. But fighters like us rarely choose the safe path. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Nina asked quietly, "And if I refuse?" Victor shrugged. "Then the Russians keep coming." He walked toward the door. Just before leaving, he paused. "You have 3 days to decide." The door opened. Cold night air spilled into the restaurant. Victor stepped outside. Then he added one last sentence without turning around. "Personally, I think you missed the fight." The door closed behind him. Nina stood in the center of Madison Grill, staring at the empty doorway. Brooks slowly lowered himself onto a chair. "You're not actually considering that, are you?" Nina didn't answer. Because deep down, Victor Moretti had touched something she had spent 3 years trying to bury. The part of her that still loved the fight. The next 3 days passed with a strange kind of quiet. Chicago continued moving the way it always did. Taxis honking, trains rattling along the elevated tracks, businessmen rushing through crowded sidewalks. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Rumors traveled fast in the underworld. Victor Moretti had been seen fighting inside a restaurant. Russian men had been dragged out of Madison Grill. And somewhere in the city, a former MMA champion was hiding under the name Nina Carter. By the third night, Nina stood alone inside a dimly lit gym on the south side of Chicago. Iron City Gym was the kind of place that had survived decades without changing much. The floor smelled faintly of old rubber mats and sweat. Heavy bags hung from rusted chains. A single ceiling fan spun slowly above the boxing ring. Nina wrapped athletic tape around her hands carefully. The sound echoed in the empty building. She had not stepped into a real fight gym in years, but muscle memory returned quickly. She hit the heavy bag once. The impact cracked through the room. Then again, and again. Each strike felt like waking up a part of herself she had locked away. Footsteps echoed behind her. Nina stopped. Victor Moretti stepped into the light beside the ring. He wore a dark coat over a black shirt, his hands resting casually in his pockets. "I wondered if you'd come here," he said. Nina wiped sweat from her forehead. "You followed me." Victor shrugged. "I know every gym in this city." He watched the bag swing gently. "So?" Nina faced him. "So?" Victor studied her expression. "Have you decided?" Nina took a slow breath. "I'm done running." Victor smiled slightly. "I thought you might say that." She looked at him carefully. "But I'm not fighting for you." Victor raised an eyebrow. "No?" "Oh, I'm fighting for myself." Victor chuckled quietly. "That works too." He stepped closer to the ring. "The Apex tournament starts tonight." Nina frowned. "Tonight?" Victor nodded. "I gave you 3 days." Nina looked down at her taped hands, then back at him. "And the Russians?" Victor's smile returned. "They're coming." Nina nodded once. "Good." Victor's eyes gleamed with approval. The Apex tournament took place inside an abandoned warehouse near the Chicago docks. Hundreds of people crowded around the makeshift ring. Criminal bosses, gamblers, fighters. The air smelled of cigar smoke and anticipation. Word had spread quickly. Victor Moretti's fighter was entering the tournament. But when Nina walked into the ring, the crowd fell into confused murmurs. "She's a woman. Is this a joke? Who is she?" Victor stood near the ring with Sal and Vinny beside him. Julian Mercer leaned against a steel railing nearby, watching the crowd nervously. "This is insane," Julian muttered. Victor didn't answer. Across the ring stood Nina's opponent, a massive Russian fighter named Sergei Volkov. He was 6'5" and built like a truck. A scar ran across his left cheek. He looked at Nina and laughed. "You are the American girl." Nina said nothing. Sergei cracked his knuckles. "My bosses pay good money for your head." Victor called up from ringside. "Try not to die." Nina smirked slightly. The bell rang. Sergei charged forward like a charging bull. His fist swung toward Nina's head. She slipped the punch. The crowd gasped. Sergei attacked again, throwing heavy hooks. Nina moved calmly around him, every step precise, every movement controlled. Victor crossed his arms. "That's it," he murmured. Sergei grew frustrated. He lunged again. This time Nina stepped inside. Her fist drove into his ribs. The giant Russian staggered. Before he could recover, her right hand snapped upward. Uppercut. Sergei's head snapped back. The entire warehouse went silent. Nina pivoted. Left hook. Sergei collapsed onto the mat like a fallen tree. The referee stared in disbelief. Then he shouted, Fight over. For a moment the crowd said nothing. Then chaos erupted. Cheers. Shouting. Money changing hands. Victor Moretti slowly smiled. Across the warehouse balcony, several Russian men stood watching. Their expressions were dark. Victor looked directly at them. Then he raised a single finger. A warning. The Russians turned and left without a word. Julian exhaled loudly. Well, Victor laughed quietly. I told you. Nina climbed out of the ring. Her breathing was heavy, but her eyes were calm. Victor stepped toward her. You just made half the criminal organizations in the Midwest rethink their plans. Nina shrugged. I just fought. Victor studied her for a long moment. You could leave now. Maybe. You've got the money. The Russians will think twice. Nina looked around the warehouse, then back at Victor. And do what? Victor didn't answer. Nina smiled slightly. You said something the other night. What? That fighters never really stop being fighters. Victor nodded. That's true. Nina extended her hand. Then maybe Chicago needs one more. Victor looked at her hand. Then he shook it. A rare gesture of respect. Above them, the crowd still roared. But in that moment, something else had changed. Victor Moretti had built his empire through fear. Nina Caldwell had built her reputation through skill. Together, they had just rewritten the balance of power in Chicago. And somewhere deep inside the city's criminal underworld, people began whispering a new story. The story of the waitress who knocked out a Russian champion. The story of the fighter who refused to run. The story of the woman who stood beside Victor Moretti without fear. Because in Chicago, power always attracted legends. And Nina Caldwell had just become one. This story reminds us that true strength is not about power, fear, or reputation. It is about courage and character. Nina did not stand up to Victor Moretti because she wanted to prove she was stronger. She did it because she refused to watch someone weaker be hurt. In a world where many people choose silence to stay safe, real integrity comes from protecting others even when it costs something. The story also shows that running from our past may keep us alive for a while, but facing it is what allows us to truly move forward. In the end, respect is not earned through intimidation, but through courage, discipline, and the willingness to stand up for what is right. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.